The wind howled across Pinecrest Valley like a mournful spirit, drowning out the sounds of the makeshift auction that had formed behind the abandoned courthouse. It wasn't the kind of gathering decent people attended, but desperation had drawn. A crowd from the shadows of society. Wooden platforms creaked under the weight of human misery, the air thick with tension and unspoken shame as lives were bartered away like cattle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Ethan Blackwood sat rigid on his chestnut stallion at the edge of the crowd, his weathered face half hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. The deep lines etched around his eyes told stories of hardship that had aged him well beyond his 35 years. 3 seasons of drought had ravaged his once prosperous ranch, leaving his fields barren and his future uncertain. He hadn't come for the spectacle. His purpose had been simple: sell his pocket watch, his last family heirloom, for enough money to keep his ranch afloat for another month. But something about the hushed whispers and predatory glances had drawn him deeper into the valley than he'd intended. The auctioneer, a slender man named Tobias Green with eyes like polished stones, commanded the crowd with practiced authority. His voice carried the rhythm of someone who'd sold everything from prize cattle to human dignity. Without a moment's hesitation, "Gentlemen," Green announced, his voice slicing through the autumn air, "our next lot requires special consideration. A woman of perhaps 25, and her twin children, boy and girl, both 6 years of age." Ethan felt his jaw clench. He'd heard rumors about these transactions in frontier territories, where the law stretched thin across vast distances, but he'd never witnessed one firsthand. The collective shame of humanity pressed close around him, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. A small cart wheeled forward, and 3 figures emerged. A woman with copper-red hair that fell in waves around her shoulders, flanked by 2 small children with the same striking hair. The woman's dress was simple but clean, her posture dignified. Despite the circumstances, the children clung to her skirts, wide-eyed and frightened but silent, as if they understood the gravity of their situation. "The woman is mute," Green continued, his voice carrying false sympathy. "Not deaf. Mind you, understands everything perfectly. Just can't speak a word. Been working at the Fairfield orphanage until its unfortunate closure last month. Excellent seamstress, capable cook, and as you can see, the children are well behaved." The crowd murmured appreciatively, their eyes assessing the trio not as people but as potential investments. Ethan noticed how some men nodded approvingly at the woman's slender figure, others at the children's strong limbs. His hands tightened around the reins of his horse. "Starting bid is $10 for all 3, Green announced. "A bargain considering you're getting to healthy children who'll grow into valuable workers." The woman's eyes, a startling shade of green, scanned the crowd with quiet defiance. There was something in her gaze that spoke volumes despite her silence, a strength that seemed at odds with her vulnerable position. The children, however, couldn't maintain such bravery. The little boy's shoulders trembled while his sister pressed her face into their mother's skirts. $10, called a voice from the crowd. Ethan recognized the speaker as Hammond, owner of the local tannery, a man known for working his people until they broke. 15, countered another voice, belonging to a well-dressed stranger whose manicured hands had never known honest work. The bidding continued, each increase feeling like another nail in the family's coffin. These men weren't looking for help around their homes. They were looking for ownership, complete control over 3 lives that would have no choice but to submit to whatever treatment was dealt them. 25, called Hammond, his voice thick with anticipation. The woman's gaze darted toward her children, and Ethan saw naked fear flash across her face for the first time. She knew what awaited them if Hammond won: separation, brutal labor, childhood stolen before they'd properly begun. $50, Ethan heard himself say. The words escaped before he'd fully formed the thought, loud and clear in the sudden silence. Heads turned toward him in surprise. Ethan Blackwood had been a fixture in Pinecrest County for nearly a decade, but since the drought had decimated his ranch, he'd become increasingly reclusive, rarely venturing into town except for absolute necessities. Green's eyebrows shot up. "Mr. Blackwood? Didn't expect to see you participating today." $50, Ethan repeated firmly, ignoring the auctioneer's comment. Hammond turned, his face darkening. "Don't interfere, Blackwood. Everyone knows your ranch is one bad season from foreclosure. You can't afford them." Ethan guided his horse closer to the platform, the crowd parting before him. Years of breaking wild horses and wrestling steers had built him into a formidable figure, and few men met his gaze directly when he was angry. $60, he countered, staring directly at Hammond. A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. $60 was a month's wages for most men present, an outrageous sum for a mute woman and 2 children, especially when offered by a man everyone knew was facing financial ruin. The woman's eyes found Effen's, and something passed between them. Not gratitude, not yet, but a question. Who was this man, and what did he want with her family? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 65. Hammond spat, his pride preventing him from backing down. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his grandfather's pocket watch, the gold catching the autumn sunlight. It was the last thing of value he owned, meant to be sold for supplies to keep his failing ranch alive through winter. "This watch is worth $100 to any fair jeweler," he said, holding it up. "I'll trade it right now, plus the $10 in my pocket. Final offer." Green's eyes widened at the sight of the gleaming timepiece. "That's a generous bid, Mr. Blackwood." Hammond cursed under his breath, but knew when he was beaten. The watch was indeed valuable, more than he was willing to pay for a mute woman and 2 children, no matter how strong they looked. "Going once," Green called. "Going twice." He paused, scanning the crowd for any last challengers. Finding none, he brought down his gavel with finality. "Sold to Ethan Blackwood." As the crowd began to disperse, grumbling about the unexpected turn of events, Ethan dismounted and approached the platform. The woman gathered her children closer, her posture wary but dignified. "Ma'am," he said quietly, removing his hat as a sign of respect, "my name is Ethan Blackwood. I have a ranch about 5 miles east of here." She nodded once, acknowledging his words, her eyes never leaving his face as she assessed him. "I don't," he began, then faltered, suddenly aware of how this must appear to her. "I don't expect anything improper. You and your children will have your own quarters. There's work if you want it, but you're not property." Something flickered in her eyes, not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first seed of hope. She reached into a small pocket sewn into her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Offering it to him with steady hands, Ethan unfolded it carefully. Written in elegant script was a simple introduction. "My name is Charlotte Harlow. These are my children, Samuel and Lily. We are grateful for your intervention." He looked up from the paper to find her watching him intently, as if his reaction to this small communication would tell her everything she needed to know about him. "It's good to meet you, Charlotte," he said, returning the paper to her. "And you too, Samuel and Lily." He knelt down to the children's level, his voice gentling. "I have a horse and wagon just over there. Are you ready to go home?" The little boy, Samuel, stepped forward slightly, his chin raised despite his fear. "Are you going to separate us?" he asked, his voice small but determined. "No," Ethan replied firmly. "You'll stay together. You have my word." Samuel exchanged a look with his mother, some silent communication passing between them. Charlotte nodded once, a decision made. As Ethan helped them into his wagon, he was acutely aware of the stares following them, the whispers that would soon transform into rumors throughout the county. A desperate rancher with a failing property had just spent his last valuable possession on a mute woman and her children. The questions and assumptions would multiply like wildfire. The journey to Blackwood Ranch passed in silence, the twins eventually falling asleep against their mother's shoulders. As the wagon swayed along the rutted trail, Charlotte remained alert, her eyes taking in the changing landscape, the town, giving way to scattered homesteads, then to open country, and finally to the rolling hills where Effen's property lay. Blackwood Ranch had once been the pride of the Eastern Valley, 3,000 acres of prime grazing land with a stream running through its heart. But as they crested the final hill, the evidence of 3 years of drought was unmistakable. The pastures were dusty and brown, the creek reduced to a trickle. The herd of cattle diminished to a few dozen animals that looked as weathered as their owner. The main house, however, still stood proud, a 2-story structure built from local timber and stone, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Behind it sat a barn in need of repairs, a chicken coop, and a small cabin that had once housed ranch hands in more prosperous times. It's not much anymore, Ethan said quietly as he brought the wagon to a stop, but the roof doesn't leak, and there's plenty of room. Charlotte studied the property with careful attention, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. Only when her eyes returned to Ethan did he see a glimmer of something that might have been understanding, one survivor recognizing another. Lily stirred first, her eyes widening as she took in the ranch. "Is this all yours?" she asked Ethan, her voice carrying the innocent wonder that only children can maintain even in the darkest circumstances. "It is," Ethan replied, helping them down from the wagon. "Been in my family for 3 generations." "Where's your family?" Samuel asked, looking around as if expecting others to emerge from the house. A shadow passed over Ethan's face. "It's just me now." Charlotte touched her son's shoulder gently, a silent reminder about sensitive questions. She reached again for her paper and pencil, quickly writing before showing Ethan. "Why did you help us?" It was a fair question, and Ethan wasn't entirely sure he had an answer, at least not one that made logical sense. How could he explain the mixture of outrage and protectiveness that had overwhelmed him at the auction? How a man who had spent 3 years focused solely on survival had suddenly committed what appeared to be financial suicide to save 3 strangers. "Because it was wrong," he said finally. "What was happening there? It was wrong." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, then nodded once, accepting his answer even if she didn't fully believe it was complete. As they approached the house, Ethan became acutely aware of its state. He'd been living alone for so long that he'd stopped noticing the dust gathering in corners, the dishes stacked in the kitchen, the general disorder of a man who'd given up on anything beyond basic survival. "I'll show you to your rooms," he said, leading them upstairs. "The east wing has 3 bedrooms. They haven't been used in some time, but the linens are clean." The rooms were simple but spacious, with large windows that caught the afternoon light. Charlotte ran her hand over a dresser, leaving a trail in the thin layer of dust, her expression thoughtful. "I know it needs work," Ethan said, misinterpreting her gesture as criticism. "I haven't had much time for." Charlotte shook her head quickly and wrote on her paper, "It's perfect. Thank you." The simple words struck Ethan with unexpected force. When was the last time anyone had thanked him for anything? When was the last time he'd done something worthy of gratitude? "I'll let you get settled," he said, suddenly uncomfortable with the emotion threatening to surface. "There's a washroom at the end of the hall, kitchen's downstairs. Help yourselves to whatever you can find. Though I should warn you, the pantry's not what it used to be." As he turned to leave, Samuel spoke up again. "Mr. Blackwood, why did you really buy us?" The directness of the child's question stopped Ethan in his tracks. He turned back, finding 3 pairs of eyes fixed on him, Lily's curious, Samuel's suspicious, and Charlotte's carefully neutral. "I told you, because it was wrong." But the man at the orphanage said no one wants a mute woman and 2 extra mouths to feed, Samuel persisted. "He said we should be grateful anyone would take us at all." Ethan felt a surge of anger toward whoever had said such a thing to a 6-year-old child. "Well, that man was wrong. Dead wrong. Are we your servants?" Now Lily asked, her small voice trembling slightly. "No," Ethan said firmly. "You're my guests." Charlotte wrote quickly, "Guests don't stay forever. What happens when you want us to leave?" The question hung between them, highlighting the precariousness of their situation. These 3 people had gone from one uncertain circumstance to another, with no guarantees about what tomorrow might bring. "You can stay as long as you need to," Ethan said, "and when you're ready to move on, I'll help you get wherever you want to go." It wasn't much of a promise, especially coming from a man whose own future was balanced on a knife's edge. but it was all he had to offer. To his surprise, it seemed to be enough for now. Charlotte nodded, a decision made, and began unpacking the small bundle of possessions they'd brought with them. That evening, Ethan prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, the best his limited supplies could manage. He was setting the table when Charlotte appeared in the kitchen doorway. Her hair now tied back, her sleeves rolled up. She gestured toward the stove, then to herself, her meaning clear. "You don't have to cook," Ethan said. "You're not." She held up a hand to stop him, then wrote quickly, "We all contribute where we can. It's the only way to survive." Something in her practical approach resonated with Ethan. He nodded and stepped aside, watching as she assessed his meager ingredients with the calculating eye of someone accustomed to making something from almost nothing. The children appeared shortly after, having washed the dust of travel from their faces. They set to work without being asked, Samuel carrying firewood from the box by the stove, Lily carefully arranging napkins beside each plate. The domesticity of the scene struck Ethan with unexpected force. His kitchen hadn't seen such activity since before the drought, when the ranch had employed half a dozen hands who gathered around this very table each evening, laughing and arguing as they recounted the day's work. The meal Charlotte prepared was simple but somehow more flavorful than anything Ethan had managed in months. As they ate, the twins gradually relaxed, their initial wariness giving way to the natural curiosity of children. "Do you have any animals besides the cows?" Lily asked, her eyes brightening at the prospect. "A few horses, some chickens." Ethan replied, "Had more before the drought." "Can we see them tomorrow?" Samuel asked, his suspicion temporarily forgotten in the face of this new adventure. "If you'd like." Charlotte watched this exchange with careful attention, her eyes moving between her children and Ethan as if assessing a complex equation. When dinner was finished, she shooed the twins upstairs to prepare for bed, then returned to clear the table. Ethan rose to help, the two of them working in companionable silence until the kitchen was clean. As Charlotte turned to follow her children upstairs, she paused, quickly writing on her ever-present paper, "Thank you for today. We won't forget it." After she had gone, Ethan sat alone on the porch, watching darkness settle over his struggling ranch. The day's events seemed surreal in retrospect. Had he really spent his last valuable possession on 3 strangers? What had possessed him to make such a reckless decision? Yet as he listened to the unfamiliar sounds of others moving about his house, the creak of floorboards, the soft murmur of children's voices, the gentle closing of doors, he felt something stir within him that had been dormant for too long. Not hope, exactly. He wasn't ready for anything that optimistic, but perhaps the first recognition that his isolation had become a prison of his own making. The auction had been held on Friday, and by Monday morning, word had spread throughout Pinecrest County that Ethan Blackwood had bought himself a ready-made family. The rumors ranged from sympathetic to scandalous, but Ethan had long since stopped caring what people thought of him. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly the Harlows would establish themselves at Blackwood Ranch. Charlotte rose before dawn, preparing breakfast and packing lunches for Ethan and the children. By the time he returned from morning chores, she had already laundered the dusty curtains, swept years of neglect from corners, and begun attacking the mountain of mending that had accumulated in his dresser drawers. The twins proved equally industrious. Samuel, despite his small size, insisted on helping with the livestock, solemnly carrying water buckets and learning to collect eggs without frightening the hens. Lily discovered the overgrown kitchen garden and set about rescuing what plants still showed signs of life beneath the weeds. By the end of the first week, the transformation was remarkable. The house breathed again, windows thrown open to release the staleness of grief and isolation. Meals became events rather than necessities, with the twins chattering about their discoveries while Charlotte listened with the alert attention of a mother who heard not just words, but the emotions beneath them. For Ethan, the change was disorienting. He had grown accustomed to silence, to moving through his days with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had reduced his existence to the basics of survival. Now his routine was constantly interrupted by Samuel's questions about ranch operations. by Lily's proud display of vegetables rescued from the garden, by Charlotte's notes asking about household management. "Why don't you ever smile?" Lily asked him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the drought-stricken landscape in deceptively beautiful colors. The question caught Ethan off guard. "I smile," he said defensively. "No, you don't," Samuel countered, with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Your mouth sometimes goes up at the corners, but it's not a real smile." Ethan glanced at Charlotte, expecting her to chastise the children for their forwardness, but she merely watched him with those perceptive, green eyes, clearly interested in his answer. "I guess I haven't had much reason to smile lately," he admitted. Lily considered this seriously. "Because of the drought?" "Partly. And the other part?" Samuel pressed. Ethan hesitated, unaccustomed to discussing his feelings with anyone, let alone children. "Sometimes when you lose things that matter, it takes the smile right out of you." Charlotte's expression softened at his words, a flash of recognition crossing her face. She reached for her writing paper, but before she could form a question, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Two riders appeared on the road leading to the ranch house, Sheriff Daniel Preston and his deputy, young men who had taken over law enforcement in Pinecrest County after the previous sheriff retired. Neither looked particularly happy to be making this visit. Ethan rose from his chair, instinctively positioning himself between the approaching men and the Harlows. "Sheriff," he called as the riders drew closer. "What brings you out this way?" Preston dismounted, his expression grim. "Evening, Blackwood. Got some questions that need answering. Regarding?" The sheriff's eyes moved past Ethan to Charlotte and the twins, his gaze lingering longer than necessary. "Regarding your new acquisitions." Ethan felt his jaw tighten. "The Harlows are my guests, not acquisitions." "That's not what witnesses from the auction say," Preston countered. "They say you paid good money for them. Sounds like a transaction to me." Charlotte had risen to her feet, her hands on her children's shoulders as she guided them toward the house door. Her face revealed nothing, but Ethan could see the tension in her posture, the way her fingers gripped the children's shoulders. "I intervened in a situation that shouldn't have been happening in the first place," Ethan said coldly. "If you have concerns about illegal auctions, perhaps you should investigate who was running it rather than harassing the people who were victimized by it." Preston's deputy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, but the sheriff remained unmoved. "There have been complaints, Blackwood. Questions about the propriety of a single man housing a young woman and her children." "Who's complaining?" Ethan demanded. "That's confidential information." Hammond, Ethan guessed, remembering the tannery owner's angry expression when outbid at the auction. Or was it Winters from the bank, hoping my impropriety might give him an excuse to foreclose early? Preston's silence confirmed Ethan's suspicions. The sheriff was a decent enough man, but he was also practical about maintaining relationships with the county's more influential citizens. "Ms. Harlow and her children have their own rooms in the East Wing," Ethan continued. "They're free to come and go as they please. I've offered them employment and shelter during difficult times, nothing more." "She able to confirm that?" Preston asked, eyeing Charlotte. "Or is the rumor about her being mute true as well?" Charlotte stepped forward, her expression proud. Despite the humiliation of being discussed as if she weren't present, she produced her writing paper and quickly penned a note, handing it to the sheriff with steady hands. Preston read it, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Well," he said, returning the paper to Charlotte, "that seems clear enough. Still, appearances matter, Blackwood. People talk, let them," Ethan replied flatly. "Unless talking becomes a crime in Pinecrest County, I don't see how it's any of your concern." The sheriff sighed, clearly unhappy with the confrontation, but unwilling to push further without more substantial complaints. "Just be careful, Blackwood. Times are hard enough without adding scandal to your troubles." After the lawmen departed, an uncomfortable silence settled over the porch. The peaceful evening had been shattered, the precariousness of their arrangement exposed like a raw nerve. "Are we in trouble?" Samuel asked, his earlier confidence replaced by the wariness Ethan had first seen at the auction. "No," Ethan assured him, though the confidence in his voice felt hollow. The sheriff was just doing his job, checking on newcomers to the county. Charlotte's eyes met Ethan's over the children's heads, her expression making it clear she understood exactly what the visit had really been about. She wrote quickly, "We're causing you problems. Perhaps we should move on." "No," Ethan said, more forcefully than he'd intended. "This is my property, and who lives here is my business. Not the sheriff's and certainly not the town gossip's." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, then wrote again, "Why does it matter so much to you?" It was a fair question, one Ethan had been asking himself with increasing frequency over the past week. Why had he risked his last valuable possession for these strangers? Why was he now risking his reputation to keep them under his roof? "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. The same answer he'd given at the auction. But this time, he added what he hadn't been ready to acknowledge before. "And because having you here, it makes this place feel like home again. I'd forgotten what that felt like." The simple admission cost him more than the pocket watch had. Ethan Blackwood had spent 3 years building walls around his heart, protecting himself from further loss by expecting nothing, connecting with no one. Admitting that the Harlows had breached those defenses was terrifying. Charlotte's expression softened, and she wrote a single word in response, "Stay." That night, as the house settled into silence, Ethan found himself unable to sleep. The sheriff's visit had stirred up memories and fears he'd managed to suppress beneath the daily grind of keeping his failing ranch afloat. He rose from his bed and moved silently through the house, checking locks and windows as had become his habit. As he passed the east wing, he heard soft sounds coming from Charlotte's room. Hesitating outside her door, he recognized the muffled sounds of someone crying, not the hiccuping sobs of children, but the controlled, near-silent weeping of an adult trying desperately not to be heard. Ethan raised his hand to knock, then lowered it again. What comfort could he offer? What right did he have to intrude on her private grief? He returned to his room, but sleep remained elusive, as he wondered what sorrows Charlotte carried that could only be expressed in the safety of darkness. The following morning, life at Blackwood Ranch resumed its new rhythm. The sheriff's visit apparently forgotten as the twins threw themselves into their daily activities with characteristic enthusiasm. But Ethan noticed a subtle change in Charlotte, a new watchfulness, a careful distance that hadn't been there before. That afternoon, as Ethan repaired fencing in the north pasture, he was surprised to see Charlotte approaching across the drought-hardened ground. She rarely ventured this far from the house, preferring to keep the children within sight. She carried a canteen of water and what appeared to be lunch wrapped in cloth. As she drew closer, Ethan realized she'd also brought paper and pencil, clearly intending a conversation that would require more than simple gestures. "Everything all right at the house?" he asked as she handed him the water. Charlotte nodded, then sat on a nearby rock, indicating he should join her. When he did, she began to write, her pencil moving swiftly across the paper. "I need to tell you our story. You deserve to know who you've brought into your home." Ethan accepted the wrapped lunch, fresh bread and sliced vegetables from Lily's garden, but shook his head at the note. "You don't owe me any explanations, Charlotte," she insisted, writing again. "Yes, I do. After last night, you need to understand." The reference to her tears made Ethan uncomfortable, confirming she'd somehow known he was outside her door. "Whatever happened before you came here is your business." Charlotte's expression turned determined as she wrote, "It becomes your business when it follows us to your door. Please, let me tell you." Recognizing her need to share her story, Ethan finally nodded. "All right." For the next hour, as the sun beat down on the parched landscape, Charlotte wrote and Ethan read, piecing together the history she felt compelled to share. I wasn't born mute. I lost my voice 7 years ago during a fever that nearly killed me. The doctors said the illness damaged my vocal cords beyond repair. Before that, I was a school teacher in Chicago. I met James Harlow there, a kind man, a journalist who believed in truth above all else. We married, had the twins, built a life we loved. 2 years ago, James uncovered corruption involving powerful men, politicians, businessmen, men who didn't appreciate their dealings being exposed in print. He published his findings anyway, believing the public deserved to know. 3 days later, our house burned to the ground while we slept. James got the children out, then went back in for me. He didn't make it out the second time. I had no family, no money after the fire. The men James exposed made sure no one would hire me. We were taken in by Fairfield Orphanage, not as residents but as charity cases. I worked for our keep, teaching the children, sewing, cooking, whatever was needed. When the orphanage closed, the director sold off what he could, furniture, equipment, and finally, the people he considered assets. That's how we ended up at the auction. The sheriff was right about one thing. There are people looking for us, not because they care about our welfare, but because I have my husband's journals, his evidence. As long as I have those, we'll never be truly safe. Ethan read the last page twice, the implications sinking in. These journals, where are they now? Charlotte hesitated, then wrote, hidden. Not here. I wouldn't bring that danger to your door without warning you first. But you think that danger might find you anyway. She nodded, her expression grave as she wrote again. The men looking for us are not just wealthy, they're desperate. If they discover where we are, they won't stop at legal means to get what they want. The pieces suddenly clicked into place for Ethan. Charlotte's watchfulness, her silent tears, the way she always positioned herself to see approaching visitors before they reached the house. That's why you were crying last night, he said quietly. You're afraid the sheriff's visit means they've found you. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly at his perception, then she nodded. Writing, not just for myself and the children, for you. Too, you've shown us kindness. I couldn't bear it if that kindness brought destruction to your door again. The again caught Ethan off guard. What do you mean, again? Charlotte's expression turned apologetic as she wrote. The drought wasn't the only disaster to strike your ranch, was it? The burn marks on the barn foundations. The way you flinch at certain sounds. Something else happened here. Something. With fire, Ethan felt his chest tighten at her perceptiveness. No one else had noticed, or if they hadn't cared enough to mention it. That's a story for another day, he said roughly, standing up. We should get back to the house before the children wonder where you've gone. As they walked back across the drought-stricken pasture, Ethan's mind raced with the implications of Charlotte's revelation. The Harlows weren't just refugees from poverty and bad luck. They were running from powerful enemies, carrying dangerous secrets. Offering them shelter had just become significantly more complicated than an impulsive act of decency. And yet, watching Charlotte walk beside him, her back straight, her steps purposeful despite the fear she carried, Ethan found himself unwilling to retract his offer. These three people had brought life back to his empty house, purpose back to his empty days. The risk they represented seemed a fair exchange for what they had already given him. Charlotte, he said as they approached the house, thank you for telling me. It doesn't change anything about your welcome here. She stopped, turning to face him with an expression of disbelief mixed with something that might have been hope. She wrote quickly, even knowing the danger. Even then, Ethan confirmed, some things are worth the risk. For the first time since they'd met, Charlotte smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her solemn face and reached her eyes, making them shine like sunlight on green leaves after rain. It was a smile worth waiting for, worth risking for. And in that moment, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that he'd made the right decision at the auction, whatever consequences might follow. As October gave way to November, life at Blackwood Ranch settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. The house, once a monument to Ethan's grief and isolation, gradually transformed under Charlotte's capable hands. Rooms that had been closed for years were opened, aired, and repurposed. The kitchen garden, revived by Lily's determined care, began providing fresh vegetables despite the late season. Samuel's natural affinity for animals revealed itself as he helped nurse a sickly calf back to health, spending hours in the barn talking softly to the creature as if it could understand every word. For Ethan, the changes extended beyond the physical improvements to his property. The wall he'd built around his emotions began to develop cracks, small at first, then increasingly significant. He found himself laughing at the twins' antics, engaging in silent but meaningful exchanges with Charlotte, planning for a future that extended beyond mere survival. The drought showed no signs of breaking, but somehow its effects seemed less catastrophic than before. Ethan implemented water conservation measures Charlotte suggested from her teaching days, experimented with drought-resistant crops Samuel had read about in one of the dusty books from the library, and even considered selling part of his herd to focus on quality over quantity, an idea that would have been unthinkable months earlier. These practical changes, however, were secondary to the emotional transformation taking place. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan found himself looking forward to each day rather than merely enduring it. The simple pleasure of sharing meals, the satisfaction of teaching the twins new skills, the quiet companionship of evenings spent on the porch with Charlotte. These small joys accumulated like raindrops, gradually filling the parched basin of his heart. Not everyone viewed these changes positively. Hammond from the tannery made a point of turning his back when Ethan entered the general store. Winters from the bank accidentally lost paperwork that would have extended Ethan's loan payments. Sheriff Preston made weekly visits to the ranch, ostensibly to check on the Harlow's welfare, but clearly monitoring for any impropriety he could report to the town's influential citizens. Despite these external pressures, the bond between Ethan and the Harlows continued to strengthen. The twins began calling him Mr. Ethan instead of the more formal Mr. Blackwood, and their initial wariness gave way to genuine affection. They sought his approval, treasured his praise, and increasingly included him in their games and discoveries. Charlotte's relationship with Ethan evolved more gradually, built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than spoken declarations. They developed a communication system that transcended her written notes, a language of glances, gestures, and intuitive understanding that sometimes left the twins marveling at how Mr. Ethan knew exactly what their mother was thinking. It was during this period of growing connection that disaster struck from an unexpected direction. Samuel, who had been fighting a mild cough for several days, woke one morning burning with fever. His breathing labored and his small face contorted with pain. Charlotte's expression transformed from concern to terror as she examined her son. She wrote frantically, "We need a doctor immediately. This isn't an ordinary fever." Ethan had already reached the same conclusion. "I'll ride to town for Dr. Miller," he said, already moving toward the door. "Keep him cool. I'll be back as quickly as possible." The ride to Pinecrest took less than half the usual time, Ethan pushing his horse to its limits over the rough terrain. Dr. Miller, a graying man with 50 years of frontier medicine under his belt, listened to Ethan's description of Samuel's symptoms with growing concern. "Sounds like pneumonia," he said grimly, gathering his medical bag. "And a bad case at that, with the boy's age and how quickly it's progressed." He left the sentence unfinished, but his expression conveyed the gravity of the situation. The return journey seemed interminable despite their pace. When they finally arrived at Blackwood Ranch, they found Charlotte kneeling beside Samuel's bed, her face pale with fear as she pressed cool cloths to his burning forehead. Lily sat in the corner, her eyes wide with worry as she clutched her brother's favorite wooden horse in her small hands. Dr. Miller's examination confirmed his initial suspicion. "Pneumonia," he announced, his weathered face grave as he listened to the boy's labored breathing. "The infection has settled deep in his lungs." Charlotte's hands trembled as she wrote, "Can you help him?" The doctor hesitated, his honesty warring with compassion. "I'll do everything I can, but I won't lie to you. This is serious. Children his age, the fever alone can be dangerous, and his breathing is already compromised." Ethan watched Charlotte's face crumple at these words, though she made no sound. Even in her deepest fear, her silence remained absolute. "What do we need?" Ethan asked, his voice rougher than intended. "Keep him cool. Make sure he drinks water. Whenever possible, even if it's just a few sips. I'll leave medicine for the fever and a tincture that might help with the congestion." Dr. Miller packed his stethoscope away. With practiced movements, the next 48 hours will be critical. If the fever breaks, he should recover. If not, he didn't need to complete the sentence. The alternative hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. After the doctor left, Charlotte refused to leave Samuel's side. She sat beside his bed, changing cool cloths, coaxing water between his parched lips, monitoring every labored breath with the fierce attention of a mother fighting death itself. For her child, Ethan sent Lily to bed in Charlotte's room, promising to wake her if there was any change in her brother's condition. Then he took up position on Samuel's other side, determined that Charlotte would not face this vigil alone. As midnight approached, Samuel's condition worsened. His breathing became more labored, each inhale a struggle that lifted his small chest with visible effort. The fever continued to climb, despite the medicine and cool compresses. In his delirium, he called for his father, the name Papa escaping his cracked lips with heartbreaking clarity. Charlotte's silent tears fell onto the bedsheets. As she stroked her son's burning forehead, she looked across at Ethan, her eyes conveying a desperation that transcended words. Without thinking, Ethan reached across the bed and took her hand. "He's going to make it," he said with a conviction he didn't entirely feel. "He's strong, Charlotte." Like his mother, she gripped his hand as if it were a lifeline, her other hand never leaving her son's face. In that moment of shared fear and determination, something fundamental shifted between them, a recognition that whatever happened in this sick room, they would face it together. As dawn approached, Samuel's fever reached its peak. His small body shook with chills despite the sweat that soaked his nightshirt. His breathing had become so labored that each exhale produced a frightening whistling sound. Charlotte wrote frantically, "He's getting worse. We need to do something." Ethan felt helpless in the face of her desperate plea. Dr. Miller had done all he could. The medicine wasn't working. The cool compresses weren't enough to combat the raging fever. Then a memory surfaced, something from his own childhood, when his younger brother had suffered a similar illness. His mother had created a steam tent, using hot water and herbs to ease the child's breathing. "I have an idea," he said, already moving toward the door. "Keep him cool. I'll be right back." He returned minutes later with a large pot of steaming water, several clean towels, and a handful of eucalyptus leaves he'd been saving to treat one of the horses for a persistent cough. "We need to create steam," he explained, setting the pot near the bed. "The moisture will help loosen whatever's in his lungs, make it easier for him to breathe." He dropped the eucalyptus leaves into the hot water, releasing their sharp, medicinal scent into the air. Then he arranged a sheet over Samuel's bed, creating a tent that captured the steam rising from the pot. Charlotte watched with desperate hope as Ethan worked, her trust in him evident in every line of her body. When the tent was complete, she positioned herself to hold it open just enough for them to monitor Samuel, while still keeping the steam concentrated around his face. For an hour, they maintained this arrangement, refreshing the hot water whenever the steam began to diminish. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, Samuel's breathing seemed to ease. The whistling sound became less pronounced, and his desperate gasps gave way to more regular inhalations. By mid-morning, the change was undeniable. The fever had begun to recede, and though Samuel remained unconscious, his breathing had stabilized enough that the blue tinge around his lips had disappeared. Charlotte's relief was palpable. She wrote with shaking hands, "You saved him." "We saved him," Ethan corrected gently. Together, she shook her head, insisting, "You knew what to do." Without that knowledge, he might have. She couldn't complete the thought, even in writing. "My mother taught me," Ethan explained, his voice soft with memory. "My brother had lung fever when he was about Samuel's age. She used steam and eucalyptus to help him breathe until the fever broke." Charlotte's next note surprised him. "Tell me about your family. You never speak of them." The request caught Ethan off guard. He'd spent so long avoiding those memories that sharing them felt almost like betrayal. But sitting here in the quiet aftermath of crisis, with Samuel breathing more easily between them, the words came more naturally than he'd expected. "My parents built this ranch from nothing," he began. "They came west with little more than a wagon and a dream, claimed this land when it was still wild territory. My father was stubborn, determined, worked himself to exhaustion every day but Sunday. My mother was the heart of the place, kept us fed, clothed, educated despite our isolation." He paused, glancing at Charlotte to see if she was truly interested or merely being polite. The genuine attentiveness in her expression encouraged him to continue. "I had two brothers and a sister. Jacob was the oldest, then me, then Mary, and finally Thomas. the one who had lung fever. We worked the ranch together, expanded it year by year. My father had plans to make it the largest operation in the county. Charlotte wrote. What happened to them? Ethan's expression darkened. Influenza, 7 years ago. It swept through the county like wildfire. My parents were the first to fall ill. Then my brothers. Mary and I cared for them as best we could. But he swallowed hard against the memory. We buried them all within 2 weeks. Mary left after that. Married a shopkeeper from Riverside and moved east. Said she couldn't bear to live with the memories. Charlotte's expression reflected understanding too deep for sympathy alone. She wrote, and you stayed. This land was their dream, Ethan said simply. Abandoning it felt like abandoning them. Charlotte considered this, then wrote, dreams can change, evolve. Your parents wouldn't want their dream to become your prison. The gentle challenge in her words struck Ethan with unexpected force. Had he been clinging to his parents' dream rather than creating his own? Had his loyalty to their memory become an excuse for his isolation? Before he could respond, Samuel stirred beneath the sheet, his eyes fluttering open for the first time. In nearly 24 hours, Mama, he whispered, his voice weak but clear. Charlotte's face transformed with joy as she gathered her son into her arms, rocking him gently while silent tears streamed down her face. She looked over Samuel's head at Ethan, her eyes conveying gratitude that transcended any written word. For Ethan, watching this reunion between mother and son, something final gave way inside his heart. The last defense against feeling, against connection, against the risk of loving people who could be lost. In that moment, he knew he would do anything to protect this family that had somehow become his own. The next 2 days saw Samuel's steady improvement. The fever disappeared completely, and though weakness lingered, his natural resilience began to reassert itself. Lily rarely left her twin's side, reading to him from Ethan's old childhood books and keeping him entertained with elaborate stories of her own invention. Charlotte divided her time between caring for Samuel and maintaining the household, though. Ethan insisted she rest whenever possible. The crisis had left her exhausted, dark circles shadowing her eyes despite her obvious relief at her son's recovery. Word of Samuel's illness had somehow reached town, and to Ethan's surprise, several families sent food and well wishes. Chicken soup from Mrs. Peterson at the general store, a jar of honey from the Williamson farm, books and puzzles for a convalescing child from the school teacher. These gestures of community support, extended to people most of the town had never met, touched Ethan deeply. He'd been so focused on the criticism and suspicion from people like Hammond that he'd forgotten the basic decency of most of his neighbors. It was during this period of recovery that Ethan made a decision he'd been contemplating since the night of Samuel's crisis. After ensuring Charlotte was resting and the twins were occupied, he rode into Pinecrest with a specific purpose in mind. The law office of Judge Wilson was a modest building near the town center, distinguished from surrounding structures only by a simple wooden sign. The judge himself, a man in his 70s who had administered justice in Pinecrest County for nearly 3 decades, looked up in surprise when Ethan entered. "Blackwood," he said, setting aside his paperwork, "this is unexpected. What brings you to my office?" "I need legal advice," Ethan replied, removing his hat as he took the offered seat, "and possibly your services as a notary." Judge Wilson leaned back in his chair, his shrewd eyes assessing Ethan with professional interest. "This wouldn't happen to concern the woman and children staying at your ranch, would it?" "It would," the judge nodded, unsurprised. "Word travels fast in small communities, Blackwood." "What exactly are you looking to do?" Ethan laid out his plan carefully, watching the older man's expression shift from curiosity to thoughtful consideration. "That's a significant legal step," the judge said when Ethan had finished. "Are you certain it's what you want?" "What they want? I'm certain it's what I want," Ethan replied. "As for the Harlows, that's a conversation I still need to have." Judge Wilson nodded, then reached for fresh paper. "Let me draft the documents. You can take them with you, discuss them with Ms. Harlow, and return when you've reached a decision together." An hour later, Ethan rode back to the ranch with the legal papers, secured inside his jacket. The weight of them against his chest felt significant, a tangible representation of the future he was hoping to build. He found Charlotte on the porch, enjoying a rare moment of solitude while the twins napped inside. Her expression brightened at his approach, a silent welcome that warmed him more than he would have thought possible months ago. "How are they?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. She wrote, "Samuel's fever hasn't returned. He's eating better today. Lily finally agreed to rest when I promised she could sleep in his room." "Good," Ethan said, then fell silent, uncertain how to broach the subject that had taken him to town. Charlotte studied his face, then wrote, "Something's on your mind. What is it?" Ethan had rehearsed this conversation on the ride home, but now that the moment had arrived, words failed him. Instead, he reached inside his jacket and withdrew the legal papers, offering them to Charlotte with uncharacteristic hesitation. She took them with a questioning glance, then began to read. As she progressed through the documents, her eyes widened, and she looked up at Ethan with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. The papers outlined a proposal for legal guardianship of Samuel and Lily Harlow, with provisions for their education, inheritance rights to Blackwood Ranch, and protection under the law as Ethan's wards. Accompanying this was a separate document establishing Charlotte's legal status as a free and independent resident of the property, with contractual rights to housing and employment for as long as she chose to remain. When Charlotte finished reading, she set the papers carefully on the small table between them, her hands trembling slightly. She reached for her writing paper. Why? The simplicity of the question deserved an equally simple answer. Because you deserve security, all of you. Because what happened at that auction should never have been possible in the first place. And because he hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. Because I care about what happens to you. To the twins, I want to make sure you're protected, even if something happens to me. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears as she wrote, "The provisions for me, as an independent resident, rather than a ward." Why the distinction? Ethan felt heat rise in his face. "I didn't want to presume. That is, you're not a child in need of guardianship. You're a grown woman who should have control over her own choices. This arrangement gives you legal protection without suggesting any relationship beyond friendship and mutual respect." Charlotte studied him for a long moment, then wrote with deliberate care, "And if I wanted a different arrangement?" The question hung between them, its implications sending Ethan's heart racing. Was she suggesting what he thought she was suggesting? He'd been so careful to keep his growing feelings contained, to respect the boundaries between them, to remember that her presence in his home had begun with an act of rescue rather than choice. "Charlotte," he began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. She wrote again, her expression serious. "I need to know what you truly want, Ethan. Not what you think is proper or expected. What do you want?" Faced with such direct questioning, Ethan could only offer honesty. "I want you to stay," he said quietly. "Not as an employee or a guest or even a friend, though you are all those things. I want you and the twins to become family, my family, but I would never presume to." Charlotte pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him with the gentle touch. Then she wrote, "Ask me properly." Understanding dawned, sending a surge of both terror and hope through Ethan's chest. He'd come to town intending only to secure legal protection for the Harlows, not daring to hope for more, but Charlotte's response had opened a possibility he'd barely allowed himself to contemplate. Taking a deep breath, Ethan moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "Charlotte Harlow," he said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, of allowing me to be a father to Samuel and Lily, of making Blackwood Ranch a true home again?" Charlotte's smile was radiant as she nodded, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. She reached for her paper one last time. "Yes, with all my heart. Yes." The simple affirmation transformed Ethan's world. He drew Charlotte into his arms, holding her with the careful reverence of a man who has been given a gift beyond his imagining. They remained that way for several minutes, the legal papers forgotten on the table beside them as they embraced their shared future. When they finally separated, Charlotte reached for the papers again, a practical question in her eyes. "These will need to be changed," Ethan acknowledged. Judge Wilson can draw up marriage documents instead, if you're certain this is what you want." Charlotte's expression turned serious. As she wrote, "Before we proceed, you should know everything. The danger my past represents is real, Ethan. The men looking for James's journals won't stop because I've found happiness. If anything, it gives them another weapon to use against me. I understand the risk," Ethan said, his voice firm, "and I accept it. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." She studied his face, searching for any hesitation. Finding none, she wrote, "Then yes, I am certain. More certain than I've been of anything since James died." The mention of her first husband sobered Ethan. "I know I can't replace him," he said quietly. "I wouldn't try to." Charlotte's expression softened as she wrote, "Love doesn't replace. It expands. James will always be part of who I am, part of the twins' history. But you, Ethan Blackwood, are our future." Inside the house, they heard the twins beginning to stir from their nap. The sound of small feet on the wooden floor, of Lily's voice speaking softly to her brother, reminded them that this decision affected more than just the two of them. "Should we tell them now?" Ethan asked. Charlotte considered this, then nodded. A mixture of excitement and nervousness crossing her face, she wrote, "Together." As they rose to enter the house, hand in hand, Ethan felt a sense of rightness settle over him. The drought might continue, the ranch might struggle, dangers from Charlotte's past might eventually find them, but none of these challenges seemed insurmountable when faced together. For the first time since the fever had taken his family, Ethan Blackwood was no longer merely surviving. He was living, loving, building a future, and that future, however uncertain, shone brighter than anything he'd dared to hope for since the day he'd ridden into Pinecrest Valley and made the impulsive decision that had changed everything. The news of Ethan and Charlotte's engagement spread through Pinecrest County with the swift efficiency of small-town gossip. Reactions varied wildly, from genuine congratulations to open scandal, from knowing nods to outright condemnation. Hammond made a public show of withdrawing his business from anyone who maintained connections with that Blackwood and his auction-bought bride. Winters at the bank suddenly discovered irregularities in Ethan's loan paperwork that required immediate resolution. Sheriff Preston appeared at the ranch with renewed concerns about the propriety of the household arrangements, even after being informed of the impending marriage. But for every negative reaction, there seemed to be a counterbalancing positive one. Mrs. Peterson from the general store offered to help with wedding preparations. The Williamson family invited all the Blackwoods, current and soon-to-be, to Sunday dinner. Dr. Miller made a point of stopping by to check on Samuel and express his personal approval of the engagement. "It's about time you had something good happen at this ranch," the old doctor said gruffly. "Couldn't have found a finer woman if you'd searched the whole territory." The weeks leading up to the wedding transformed Blackwood Ranch in ways both visible and invisible. Charlotte threw herself into preparations with practical enthusiasm, refusing to let limited resources dampen the significance of the occasion. The house underwent a thorough cleaning, with every surface scrubbed until it gleamed. Faded curtains were repurposed into new tablecloths. Old furniture was polished to reveal forgotten beauty beneath years of neglect. Lily appointed herself official decorator, collecting autumn wildflowers and arranging them in mismatched jars throughout the house. Samuel, fully recovered from his illness, insisted on helping Ethan with ranch repairs, determined that everything should be perfect for the day his mother would become Mrs. Blackwood. "Do you think I could call you Pa after the wedding?" Samuel asked one afternoon as they mended the chicken coop together. The simple question caught Ethan by surprise, filling his throat with emotion he struggled to control. "I'd be honored," he managed finally, "but only if you're comfortable with it." Samuel nodded seriously, considering this. "I don't remember my real Pa much anymore. Just his voice sometimes, reading stories. But Mama says he'd be happy we found you." "Does she now?" Ethan asked, touched by the revelation. "She wrote it in my journal. She writes me things sometimes, important things she wants me to remember." Samuel hammered a nail with determined concentration. "She wrote that love isn't something that runs out when you use it. It just makes more of itself." The profound wisdom, filtered through a child's understanding, struck Ethan deeply. Charlotte had found a way to preserve her children's connection to their father while making space for a new relationship, a balance Ethan had worried might be impossible to achieve. The wedding itself was planned as a small, private ceremony at the ranch, with Judge Wilson officiating and only a handful of trusted neighbors in attendance. Charlotte had no family to invite, and Ethan's sister Mary had not responded to his letter announcing the engagement. 2 days before the wedding, however, an unexpected carriage arrived at Blackwood Ranch. Ethan was repairing fence posts in the south pasture when he heard the unmistakable sound of approaching wheels. He looked up to see a hired carriage from the Pinecrest stagecoach office, making its way up the dusty drive. Concerned that it might be more trouble from Hammond or his allies, Ethan abandoned his work and strode quickly toward the house, arriving just as the carriage pulled to a stop in the front yard. The woman who emerged was elegantly dressed, her traveling suit suggesting both wealth and taste. She stood uncertainly beside the carriage, scanning the property with an expression that mingled curiosity and apprehension. When her gaze finally settled on Ethan, her eyes widened in recognition. "Ethan," she called hesitantly, "is that you?" Ethan froze, the hammer still clutched in his hand. It had been 7 years since he'd seen his sister, but despite the fashionable clothes and carefully arranged hair, he would have known her anywhere. "Mary," he said, his voice rough with surprise. What are you doing here?" The isolation that had defined his existence had given way to connection, not just with Charlotte and the twins, but with the broader community that had begun to embrace their unconventional family. Standing on the porch with Charlotte at his side, watching the last of their guests disappear down the dusty drive as the setting sun painted the landscape in gold, Ethan felt a peace he had thought forever beyond his reach. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said softly, savoring the newness of the title. "How does it feel?" Charlotte's smile was radiant as she wrote, "Like coming home after a very long journey." The simple sentiment captured perfectly what they had found in each other. Not just love or companionship, but the profound sense of belonging that comes when broken pieces find their perfect match and create something stronger than they had been before. As darkness fell over Blackwood Ranch, bringing with it the promise of their first night as husband and wife, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead, whether drought or danger or the everyday trials of family life, they would face them together, drawing strength from the bonds they had forged through choice rather than circumstance. The desperate rancher who had bought a mute woman and her twins at auction had found something far more precious than he could have imagined, not property or possession, but partnership, not obedience, but strength, not silent submission, but a love whose eloquence transcended words. And in that discovery lay the most profound truth of all. Sometimes the greatest journeys begin with the smallest acts of kindness, and the most broken hearts are precisely those most capable of extraordinary healing. The seasons turned with the steady rhythm that had governed Blackwood Ranch for generations, each day building upon the last to create a tapestry of shared life that grew richer and more complex with the passage of time. Winter arrived early that year, bringing not the gentle snowfall they had hoped might break the drought, but bitter winds that howled across the parched landscape like hungry wolves. Yet within the walls of the ranch house, warmth prevailed. The family adjusted to their new reality with a seamlessness that sometimes surprised even them. The twins took to calling Ethan Pa without hesitation, as if they had been waiting their whole young lives for the privilege. Charlotte transformed from guest to mistress of the house with quiet authority, her organizational skills and practical nature bringing order to spaces that had known only bachelor chaos for years. Most evenings found them gathered around the fireplace after supper, Charlotte mending clothes or working on the quilt she was creating from salvaged fabric, Ethan reading aloud from one of the books Mary had sent from Denver, the twins engaged in quiet games or simply listening to the stories that expanded their world beyond the boundaries of the ranch. "Do you think it will ever rain again, Pa?" Samuel asked one particularly frigid evening as the wind rattled the window panes. With unusual ferocity, Ethan looked up from the book of Western exploration he'd been reading. "It will," he said with more confidence than he felt. "The land has seen droughts before. They always break eventually. But what if this one doesn't? Lily persisted, her practical nature requiring more than blind faith. What happens to the ranch then? I'll accompany Mrs. Blackwood personally, Sheriff Preston offered. Deputy Collins will remain here with you and the children. We'll be back within 2 days, weather permitting. The decision made. They turned to practical preparations. Preston and Collins would spend the night at the ranch. Departing with Charlotte at first light, Ethan would explain to the twins that their mother needed to attend to business matters with the sheriff. A partial truth that would spare them unnecessary fear. After the law officers had settled in the spare bedroom, and Charlotte had checked on the sleeping twins one last time, she and Ethan retired to their room. The privacy allowed Charlotte's carefully maintained composure to finally crack, her hands trembling as she wrote, "I'm afraid, Ethan, not of what might happen to me, but of what might happen to all of you if I've made the wrong choice." Ethan gathered her into his arms, holding her with the gentle strength that had become her anchor in the months since they'd met. "There are no guarantees in this life," he said softly against her hair, "but hiding and running have their own costs. You taught me that when you chose to tell Preston about the journals in the first place." Charlotte nodded against his chest, then pulled back to write, "If something happens to me, promise you'll keep the children safe, get them far away from here, perhaps to Marion, Denver." "Nothing is going to happen to you," Ethan insisted, unwilling to entertain the possibility. "But yes, I promise, they'll always be protected, always be loved, no matter what." They held each other through the night, sleep coming in fitful bursts, between periods of watchful listening as the storm intensified outside. By morning, the landscape had transformed, a pristine blanket of snow covering the drought-scarred earth, like nature's attempt to hide the wounds of the previous seasons. The departure was subdued, but efficient. Charlotte embraced the still sleepy twins with fierce tenderness, her eyes conveying the love her voice could not express. Ethan helped her mount the sturdy mare Preston had brought specifically for the journey, adjusting her heavy winter cloak to provide maximum protection against the biting cold. 2 days, Ethan said, looking up at his wife with a conviction he was determined to maintain. "We'll be waiting." Charlotte nodded, her eyes communicating everything words could not: love, determination, the promise of return. Then she and Preston were gone, their figures gradually disappearing into the snowy landscape as Ethan and Deputy Collins watched. From the porch, the first day of Charlotte's absence passed with excruciating slowness. Ethan maintained a cheerful facade for the twins' benefit, involving them in indoor projects that kept their minds occupied and their hands busy. Deputy Collins proved unexpectedly adept with children, teaching Samuel and Lily to play checkers with a hand-carved set he produced from his saddlebag. "My own young'uns are about their age," he explained when Ethan commented on his easy rapport with the twins. "Miss them something fierce when I'm on duty." The casual revelation of this shared humanity, that the deputy was not just a symbol of authority, but a father missing his children, helped ease some of Ethan's tension. These men were risking their own safety to protect his family, a debt he wasn't sure he could ever repay. The second day dawned clear but bitterly cold, the temperature dropping to levels that made even brief exposure painful. Ethan found himself constantly at the window, scanning the horizon for any sign of returning riders despite knowing it was too early to expect Charlotte and the sheriff. It was mid-afternoon when the sound of approaching horses finally broke. The waiting silence, Ethan rushed to the window, his heart leaping, only to freeze at the sight of not two, but four riders approaching the ranch house. "Collins," he called sharply. "Riders coming." 4 of them. The deputy joined him at the window, his expression immediately sharpening. "That's not Preston," he confirmed grimly, recognizing neither the horses nor the riders' silhouettes. "The twins," Ethan said urgently. "Get them to the cellar, now." As Collins hurried to gather the children, Ethan retrieved his rifle and moved to a position that offered both a clear view of the approaching riders and cover if shooting began. Through the window, he could make out more details as the men drew closer, one tall and thin, another shorter and heavier, matching the descriptions of Crane and Mercer. The other two appeared to be hired muscle, their expressions hard even at a distance. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the house. clearly assessing the situation before proceeding. Ethan used the moment to check that Collins had successfully hidden the twins in the root cellar beneath the kitchen, accessible only through a trapdoor that could be easily concealed by moving the heavy table over it. There in place, Collins confirmed as he returned, his own weapon ready, told them to stay absolutely quiet no matter what they hear. Ethan nodded gratefully, then returned his attention to the window. The riders had separated, to remaining mounted while two, the tall man and one of the hired guns, dismounted and began approaching the house directly. "Mr. Blackwood," called the tall man, his voice carrying easily in the still winter air. "We're here on legitimate business. No need for unpleasantness if you cooperate." Ethan exchanged glances with Collins, who positioned himself at the second window with a clear line of sight to the approaching men. "State your business," Ethan called back, keeping his rifle visible but not directly aimed, a warning rather than an immediate threat. "The name's Victor Crane," the tall man replied, confirming their worst fears. "I represent certain interests in Chicago who have unfinished business with Charlotte Harlow, or Blackwood, as I understand she's called now. My wife isn't here." Ethan responded truthfully, "And any business you have with her can be conducted through proper legal channels." Crane's laugh held no humor. "I don't know anything about papers," Ethan maintained, watching as the men continued their slow approach. They were now close enough that he could see the scar running down Crane's face, a pale line that twisted his features into a permanent sneer. "Maybe not," Crane conceded, "but I think you know where she is, and I think those children of hers might be here." Children often know more than adults give them credit for. The casual threat toward the twins ignited a protective rage in Ethan that nearly overwhelmed his caution. Only Collins's warning gesture kept him from responding with immediate violence. "There are no children here," Ethan lied, his voice steady despite his fury. "And as I said, my wife is away on business." Crane and his companion had reached the yard now, close enough that Ethan could see the calculating assessment in the man's cold eyes. "Business, you say? Would that business happen to involve a certain bank in Riverside?" The implication sent ice through Ethan's veins. How could they possibly know Charlotte's destination unless Sheriff Preston sent a telegram from Riverside? "Early this morning," Crane continued, confirming Ethan's unspoken fear. "Unfortunately, he seems to have met with an accident on his return journey. Very icy conditions in the mountain passes this time of year." Collins swore under his breath, his knuckles whitening on his weapon. "They've done something to Preston," he muttered. "And if they're here instead of intercepting Charlotte on the road." He didn't need to finish the thought. Either Charlotte had already been captured, or she was walking into a trap with no idea that her escort had been compromised. "What do you want?" Ethan demanded, playing for time as he tried to formulate a plan. "It's quite simple," Crane replied. "We want the journals James Harlow compiled before his unfortunate accident. We know Charlotte has them. We know she's likely retrieving them from Riverside as we speak, and we know she'll return here to her beloved husband and those precious children." The smug certainty in Crane's voice made it clear what he intended: to use Ethan and the twins as leverage to force Charlotte's compliance when she returned. "So here's how this will proceed," Crane continued, gesturing to his companion who had begun moving toward the side of the house, clearly intending to find another entrance. "You're going to invite us inside to wait comfortably for your wife's return. If you cooperate, no one needs to get hurt. If you resist..." His hand moved meaningfully toward the gun at his hip. Ethan's mind raced, calculating odds and options. He and Collins were outnumbered, but had the advantage of cover. The twins were hidden, but vulnerable if the house was searched thoroughly. And Charlotte was riding into danger with no warning, possibly alone if something had indeed happened to Sheriff Preston. In that critical moment of decision, Ethan recalled Charlotte's words from months earlier. Sometimes the greatest strength is knowing when to hold fast and when to change course. What they needed now wasn't a frontal confrontation that might endanger the children, but a strategy that would protect everyone while turning the tables on their adversaries. "All right," Ethan called, lowering his rifle slightly. "Let's discuss this reasonably. But just you. Crane, your men stay outside where I can see them." Crane's expression showed momentary surprise at this apparent capitulation, followed by smug satisfaction. Wise decision, Blackwood. Very wise indeed. As Crane signaled his companion to rejoin the men by the horses, Ethan turned to Collins with urgent instructions, speaking quickly and quietly to outline his hastily formulated plan. The deputy's eyes widened, but he nodded in agreement. It's risky, he acknowledged, but it might be our best chance. Ethan moved to the door, rifle still in hand, but held less threateningly as he prepared to invite the wolf into his home. The next few hours would determine not just his family's safety, but their freedom from the shadows that had haunted Charlotte for too long. What followed was a masterclass in strategic patience and calculated risk. Ethan allowed Crane into the house, maintaining the fiction that he was alone except for Deputy Collins, who was introduced as a ranch hand staying during the bad weather. While appearing to cooperate, Ethan carefully guided the conversation to extract information about Crane's intentions and the whereabouts of Charlotte. Your wife should be crossing Henderson Pass about now, Crane remarked casually as he accepted the coffee Ethan reluctantly offered. Nasty stretch of road in this weather. Accidents happen so easily. The implied threat was clear, but it also confirmed what Ethan needed to know. Charlotte had not yet been intercepted. She was still free, still potentially able to avoid the trap if warned in time. While Ethan kept Crane engaged in the main room, Collins slipped away under the pretense of bringing more firewood. Instead, he executed the riskiest part of their plan, retrieving the twins from the cellar and escaping through the back window of the kitchen to the barn where they could mount fresh horses and ride for help. The success of this maneuver depended entirely on timing and the twins' ability to remain absolutely silent during their escape. Samuel and Lily, already proving themselves remarkably resilient, followed Collins's instructions with perfect discipline, understanding without being told that their family's safety depended on their courage. As Collins and the twins made their desperate ride toward the nearest neighbor's ranch 5 miles away, Ethan continued his dangerous game of hospitality with Crane, who grew increasingly impatient as the afternoon waned. Your men must be getting cold out there, Ethan observed, careful to maintain his pretense of cooperation while watching for any sign that Crane had detected their deception. They're paid well to endure discomfort, Crane replied dismissively. Now, about these journals. What exactly has Charlotte told you about their contents? Ethan shrugged. Very little. My wife's past is her own business. Crane's eyes narrowed. Her past became your business the moment you married her, Blackwood. Those journals contain allegations against men of considerable influence and power. False allegations that could damage reputations built over decades of public service. If the allegations are false, why the concern? Ethan countered, unable to resist the logical challenge despite the danger of antagonizing his unwelcome guest. Crane's expression hardened. Even false accusations can cause irreparable harm when presented convincingly. James Harlow was a talented writer with a gift for making fiction sound like fact. His death was unfortunate, but necessary to prevent widespread damage to innocent parties. The casual admission of murder, framed as regrettable necessity, confirmed everything Charlotte had feared about these men. They would stop at nothing to protect themselves, including eliminating an entire family if required. As the light began to fade outside, Crane's patience finally expired. Your wife should have returned by now, he said coldly, rising from his seat, and your ranch hand has been gone far too long for firewood. What game are you playing? Blackwood. Ethan rose as well, abandoning the pretense of cooperation. No game, Crane. Just buying time for my family to reach safety. Fury transformed Crane's scarred face into something truly monstrous. You've made a serious mistake, he snarled, reaching for his weapon. One your wife and children will pay for unless you tell me exactly where they've gone. Ethan stood his ground, prepared for the violence that now seemed inevitable. My family is beyond your reach, he said with a conviction born of desperate hope rather than certainty. And so are the journals. The standoff might have ended in bloodshed then and there, but fate intervened in the form of thundering hoofbeats approaching from the east. Too many for it to be just Collins returning with help. Crane moved to the window, his expression darkening as he saw not the expected arrival of Charlotte, but a group of at least 6 riders approaching at speed, led by a figure Ethan recognized even at a distance, Sheriff Preston, very much alive. Despite Crane's earlier implications, "You're out of options, Crane," Ethan said quietly. "Whatever happened to your plan, it's failed." The realization of defeat registered in Crane's eyes, quickly replaced by a cold calculation that Ethan recognized as perhaps more dangerous than open violence. Cornered predators were often at their most lethal. "This isn't over," Crane promised, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "My employers don't accept failure." "Neither do I," came a new voice from the doorway, Charlotte's distinctive writing pad appearing first, followed by the woman herself, her expression as fierce and determined as Ethan had ever seen it. While Crane's attention had been fixed on the approaching riders, Charlotte had entered through the kitchen, moving with the silent grace that her years of muteness had perfected. She held not a weapon but her writing pad, on which she had already prepared her message. "Your employers are already under federal investigation. Copies of the journals reached the Justice Department this morning. It's over, Crane." The announcement struck Crane with almost physical force, his composure finally cracking to reveal genuine fear beneath the confident exterior. Outside, Sheriff Preston and his posse had surrounded Crane's men, who appeared to be surrendering without resistance. "Impossible," Crane whispered, his gaze fixed on Charlotte with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "The journals were in Riverside. You couldn't have." Charlotte's smile held no warmth as she wrote. "The Riverside box contained only directions to the real location. I've had years to plan for this moment, Crane. Years to ensure that if anything happened to me or my family, the truth would find its way to people who would act on it." The elegant simplicity of Charlotte's countermeasure left Ethan in awe of his wife's foresight and strategic thinking. She had created not just insurance but a mechanism for justice that would activate whether she lived or died, protecting not just her family but the truth her first husband had died to expose. As Sheriff Preston entered the house with his deputy, Crane's final resistance collapsed. He surrendered his weapon without further protest, his expression that of a man who recognized that forces beyond his control had finally caught up with him. "Charlotte," Ethan breathed, crossing the room to embrace his wife with relief so profound it bordered on pain. "How did you?" She pressed a finger to his lips, then wrote quickly. "The children." "Safe," he assured her. "Collins got them out. They should be at the Peterson farm by now." The reunion that followed, as deputies took Crane and his associates into custody, as the twins were brought safely home, as the full story of Charlotte's journey and Preston's successful ambush of Crane's reinforcements was shared, became the stuff of Pinecrest County legend. The tale of how a mute woman outwitted dangerous men, how a desperate rancher protected his adopted family, how a community finally rallied around those they had once viewed with suspicion, would be told and retold for generations, but for the Blackwood family, gathered once again around their fireplace as the winter night deepened outside. The true miracle wasn't in the danger escaped, but in the future secured. The shadows that had haunted Charlotte since her first husband's death had finally been banished, replaced by the certainty that her children could grow up without fear, that the truth James Harlow died for would finally serve justice, that the family they had built from broken pieces would endure. "I knew you'd find a way," Ethan said softly as the twins finally succumbed to exhaustion, curled together on the rug before the fire like puppies after adventure. "From the moment I saw you on that auction platform, I knew you were stronger than anyone realized." Charlotte's eyes shimmered with emotion as she wrote, "We found a way together. You chose kindness that day at the auction, Ethan. That choice changed everything for me. For the children, for you. One act of courage opened the door to all that followed." The profound truth of her observation settled over Ethan like a blessing. His impulsive decision to intervene at the auction, driven by outrage and compassion rather than calculated planning, had indeed been the pebble that started an avalanche of transformation. From that single moment of choosing kindness over indifference had flowed all the subsequent choices that led to this night of hard-won peace. As Charlotte rested her head against his shoulder, her breathing gradually slowing into the rhythm of deserved rest. Ethan reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The desperate rancher who had purchased a mute woman and her twins at auction had found not possessions but partners, not silence but profound communication, not a transaction, but a transformation that had healed wounds he hadn't known could be healed. Outside, the winter stars shone with cold brilliance over Blackwood Ranch, witnessing the simple truth that sometimes the most desperate choices lead to the most beautiful destinations, and that kindness, even when it appears foolish or impractical, may be the most powerful force in reshaping broken lives into something whole and beautiful again. The drought would eventually break, as all droughts must. The ranch would either survive or transform into something new. But the family forged in that desperate auction, bound by choice rather than blood, strengthened by shared struggles, defined by love that transcended words, would endure as living testimony to the extraordinary power of ordinary courage, and the healing that becomes possible when broken hearts dare to love again. And that, perhaps, was the greatest miracle of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.